The year is 629. The location, Mu'tah, a dust-covered plain in what is now southern Jordan. 3,000 men stand in formation, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They are warriors of the nascent Islamic State, sent on a military expedition that would become legendary. Across from them, stretching as far as the eye can see, stands an army that dwarfs their numbers by a ratio that defies military logic. 200,000 soldiers. The Byzantine Empire has mobilized one of the largest forces it has ever assembled for a single engagement. Elite cavalry units, heavily armored infantry, Arab tribal allies from the Ghassanid kingdom. This is the full might of Rome's eastern territories. The math is brutal. For every Muslim warrior, there are approximately 67 enemy soldiers. No reinforcements are coming. No supply lines can sustain them. The nearest friendly territory is hundreds of miles away through hostile desert. This is not a battle anyone expected them to survive. But what happened over the next days would gend the Byzantine Empire to its core and forge reputations that would echo through 14 centuries of history. The Muslim forces would inflict devastating casualties on an army that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude. They would terrify seasoned Roman legionnaires with tactics and ferocity never before witnessed. And they would execute a combat withdrawal so masterful that military academies still study it today. 3 commanders would fall in battle, each fighting until their final breath. The 4th commander, a man who would become known as the Sword of Allah, would orchestrate a strategic masterpiece that turned what should have been annihilation into a legendary demonstration of tactical brilliance. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is a story of impossible odds, extraordinary courage, and strategic genius that changed the course of history. The question is not whether the Muslims could win. The question is how 3,000 men faced 200,000 and lived to tell about it. How did they inflict such heavy losses on the Byzantine forces that the empire would hesitate to engage them again? How did a tactical retreat become a strategic victory? The answers lie in leadership under extreme pressure, in tactical innovation born of desperation, and in a level of combat ferocity that shocked an empire. This is the Battle of Mu'tah. Every detail you are about to hear is documented in historical sources. No embellishment is needed. The truth is extraordinary enough. To understand Mu'tah, you must first understand the world of 629. The Arabian Peninsula had undergone a transformation in less than 2 decades. What had been a collection of warring tribes, bound by blood feuds and ancient rivalries, was now unified under a new religious and political order. The Prophet Muhammad had established a state in Medina that was expanding its influence across Arabia. This expansion did not occur in a vacuum. To the north loomed the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of Rome's eastern territories, controlling vast swaths of territory from Constantinople to the borders of Arabia. To the northeast sat the Sassanid Persian Empire. These 2 superpowers had been locked in devastating wars for decades, draining their treasuries and armies. The nascent Islamic State had begun sending emissaries to neighboring rulers, calling them to accept Islam or at least establish peaceful relations. One such emissary was al-Harith ibn Umayr al-Azdi. He was dispatched to carry a letter to the ruler of Busra, a Byzantine-controlled city in southern Syria. He never completed his mission. At a place called Mu'tah, al-Harith was intercepted by Shurabil ibn Amr al-Ghassani, a governor loyal to Byzantium. In a decision that would have catastrophic consequences, Shurabil ordered the emissary executed. This was not merely murder. In the diplomatic customs of the time, killing an ambassador was among the gravest violations imaginable. It was a declaration that demanded response. When news reached Medina, the Prophet Muhammad made a decisive call. He would send a military expedition to the Byzantine borders. The force would consist of 3,000 men, the largest army the Muslims had assembled to that point. The command structure was unusual and deliberate. The Prophet appointed 3 commanders in succession. Zayd ibn Haritha would lead first. If Zayd fell, command would pass to Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. If Ja'far fell, Abdullah ibn Rawaha would take command. This chain of succession revealed the Prophet's understanding of the danger ahead. Zayd ibn Haritha was one of the Prophet's closest companions. He had been enslaved as a child, purchased by the Prophet's first wife Khadijah, and given to Muhammad as a gift. Muhammad had offered Zayd his freedom and the chance to return to his tribe. Zayd chose to stay. The Prophet formally adopted him as a son. Zayd was approximately 55 years old at Mu'tah, a veteran of numerous battles, respected for his loyalty and tactical competence. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was the Prophet's cousin, brother to Ali ibn Abi Talib. He had led the migration of early Muslims to Abyssinia years earlier, where his eloquence before the Negus had secured their protection. Ja'far was known for his generosity, his strategic mind, and his fearlessness in combat. He was approximately 39 years old. Abdullah ibn Rawaha was a poet and warrior, one of the Ansar, the Medinan Muslims who had given the early Muslim community refuge. He was known for his quick wit, his devotional poetry, and his unflinching courage. He had participated in nearly every major engagement since the Battle of Badr. There was a fourth man whose role would prove decisive, though he was not part of the original command structure: Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid was approximately 39 years old. He came from the Quraysh aristocracy of Mecca and had been one of Islam's fiercest enemies. At the Battle of Uhud, he had commanded the cavalry that turned near defeat for the Meccans into a devastating blow against the Muslims. He had accepted Islam only 2 years before Mu'tah, but his reputation as a military tactician was already established. He was known for his analytical mind, his ability to read terrain and enemy formations, and his absolute ruthlessness in combat. The Muslim force began its march northward. As they traveled through the desert, intelligence reached them that shattered any illusions about the nature of their mission. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius had mobilized a massive army. Reports varied, but the consensus was staggering: 200,000 men. This included Byzantine professional soldiers, Armenian and Syrian auxiliary units, and a large contingent of Ghassanid Arab tribal warriors who served as Roman clients. The Ghassanids alone could field tens of thousands of experienced fighters. When the Muslim army reached Ma'an in southern Jordan, they halted. A council of war convened. The debate was intense. Some argued for retreat. They were not facing a raiding party or a tribal coalition. This was the full military apparatus of an empire that had existed for centuries. Abdullah ibn Rawaha silenced the debate. He reminded them why they fought. They sought martyrdom or victory. Either outcome was acceptable. Retreat was not. The army continued toward Mu'tah. The Byzantine forces had established their position near the village of Mu'tah. The Romans knew the Muslims were coming. They had chosen the ground deliberately, open terrain that favored their numerical advantage and their heavy cavalry. No forests for ambush, no narrow passes to neutralize superior numbers. The Muslim army had marched into a situation where every conventional military principle dictated certain annihilation. What happened next would defy those principles entirely. The Muslim army moved through the barren landscape of southern Jordan, each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation that grew more daunting with every piece of intelligence that reached them. The journey from Medina to Mu'tah covered approximately 500 miles. The route took them through territories where loyalties were uncertain. Some Bedouin tribes observed their passage with curiosity, others with hostility. The Muslims were entering regions where Byzantine influence was strong, where Christian Arab tribes had served Roman interests for generations. As they approached the Syrian borderlands, scouts brought increasingly alarming reports. The Byzantine army was not a garrison force or a punitive expedition. Emperor Heraclius had personally ordered the mobilization. The assembly point was near the Balka region. The numbers kept growing in the reports. 100,000, then 150,000, finally settling on estimates of 200,000 soldiers. The composition of this force was as intimidating as its size. The corps consisted of Byzantine regular troops, professional soldiers drawn from across the empire's eastern provinces. These were not militia or hastily conscripted peasants. They were experienced fighters, many veterans of the long wars against Persia. Supporting them were Armenian cavalry units, renowned for their horsemanship and archery, Syrian Christian contingents who knew the terrain intimately, and crucially, the Ghassanid Arabs, a powerful tribal confederation that had served as Byzantine clients for over a century. The Ghassanids provided not just numbers, but desert warfare expertise that matched anything the Muslims could bring. When the Muslim vanguard reached Ma'an, they made camp. The leadership convened to assess their situation. The reality was undeniable. They were outnumbered by a ratio that made conventional battle suicidal. Supply lines were non-existent. Reinforcements were impossible. Retreat would take days through hostile territory where Byzantine cavalry could run them down. Arguments erupted. Several commanders advocated sending word back to Medina, requesting either more troops or permission to withdraw. The mission had been to punish those responsible for killing the emissary, not to engage the entire Byzantine military machine. Abdullah ibn Rawaha ended the debate with words that became legendary among the early Muslims. He reminded them that they did not fight for worldly gain. Their strength did not come from numbers or equipment. They fought for a cause that transcended tactical calculations. He pointed out that in previous battles, they had prevailed against superior numbers. At Badr, 300 Muslims had defeated 1,000 Meccans. The outcome of battle was not determined by arithmetic. His argument carried the day. The army resumed its march toward Mu'tah. The Byzantines had chosen their position with strategic precision. The village of Mu'tah sat in an area of rolling plains, broken by wadis and rocky outcrops, but offering no significant defensive positions for a smaller force. The terrain favored cavalry maneuvers and the deployment of large formations. For an army of 200,000, it was ideal ground. The Byzantine commander was likely Theodore Tritherius, though sources differ on whether he directly commanded or served under another general. What is clear is that the Byzantine leadership understood they faced an unusual opponent. Reports had reached them of Muslim military successes in Arabia. They were taking no chances. The deployment was methodical and overwhelming. The Byzantine formation stretched across the plain in depth and breadth. Heavy infantry formed the center, their armor glinting in the sun. Cavalry wings extended on both flanks, ready to envelop any force foolish enough to engage. Archer units were positioned to provide covering fire. The Ghassanid Arabs formed mobile reserve forces, capable of rapid deployment to any point in the line. The Muslims arrived and surveyed the situation. What they saw confirmed their worst assessments. This was not an army that could be outmaneuvered or surprised. This was a military force designed to crush through sheer mass and discipline. Zayd ibn Haritha organized the Muslim forces according to principles that would become standard in Islamic military practice. He divided the 3,000 men into a center and two wings. The center would be the anvil, absorbing the Byzantine assault. The wings would attempt to protect the flanks and prevent complete encirclement. Khalid ibn al-Walid was assigned command of one of the flanks. Even at this stage, before he assumed overall command, his tactical acumen was recognized. He studied the Byzantine dispositions carefully, noting the gaps between units, the rhythm of their formations, the behavior of their cavalry. The night before battle, the Muslim camp was somber. Men performed their prayers. Some wrote final messages to loved ones. Others sharpened weapons and checked equipment. The commanders moved among the ranks, offering words of encouragement. There was no illusion about what dawn would bring. The Byzantines had the advantage in every measurable category: numbers, equipment, position, supply, reinforcement potential. The Muslims had courage, religious conviction, and desperate determination. Abdullah ibn Rawaha composed poetry that night, verses that spoke of longing for martyrdom and contempt for a life lived in compromise. His words circulated through the camp, hardening resolve. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib spent time with his horse, checking its shoes and tackle. He had fought in numerous engagements, but never anything approaching this scale. He knew his role. If Zayd fell, the burden of command would fall on him. He had to be ready to step into chaos and maintain cohesion. Zayd himself walked the perimeter, ensuring sentries were alert. He was the senior commander, the man entrusted with 3,000 lives in a mission that looked increasingly like a martyrdom operation. Yet historical sources report no hesitation in him. He had chosen his path decades earlier, when he chose to remain with the Prophet, rather than return to his tribe. This was simply the continuation of that choice. The Byzantine camp, by contrast, was confident. They had assembled an overwhelming force. The Muslims were brave, but doomed. Tomorrow would demonstrate to the Arabian upstarts the futility of challenging Roman power. Both armies settled in for the night. Dawn would bring blood. Dawn broke over the plains of Mu'tah on a day in the Islamic month of Jumada al-Awwal, year 8 of the Hijra. The Byzantine army began its deployment at first light, a process that took hours given the sheer scale of the force. Drums beat cadence as units moved into position. The sound carried across the plain, a psychological weapon in itself. Zayd ibn Haritha assembled his 3,000 men in battle formation. He placed himself at the center, holding the white banner that the Prophet Muhammad had personally handed him in Medina. This banner was more than a tactical marker. It was a symbol of authority and continuity. As long as it flew, the army maintained cohesion. The Muslim lines were thin compared to the Byzantine depth. Where the Romans deployed in multiple ranks that could rotate fresh troops forward, the Muslims had barely enough men to form a credible front. Zayd organized them to maximize their striking power, while maintaining enough reserve to prevent immediate collapse. Khalid ibn al-Walid commanded the right wing. His cavalry numbered perhaps a few hundred horsemen, facing Byzantine and Ghassanid cavalry forces that outnumbered them 10 to 1 or more. Qutbah ibn Qatada commanded the left wing with similar numbers. The center held the majority of the infantry under Zayd's direct command. The Byzantines advanced methodically. Their front rank consisted of heavily armored infantry, cataphracts in some units, men encased in chainmail and scale armor. Behind them came lighter infantry and archers. The cavalry wings moved to envelop positions, seeking to surround the Muslim flanks. The initial contact came mid-morning. The Byzantine front slammed into the Muslim center with massive force. Shields crashed against shields, spears thrust into gaps in formations. The noise was overwhelming. Metal on metal, screams of wounded men, officers shouting orders that were barely audible over the chaos. Zayd fought in the front rank. This was standard practice for early Muslim commanders. Leadership was demonstrated through personal combat, not from safe positions in the rear. He wielded his sword with the experience of decades of fighting, cutting down Byzantine soldiers who pressed forward. The Muslim line buckled, but held. Men filled gaps left by fallen comrades. The discipline that had been drilled into them during years of conflict in Arabia manifested here against a far more numerous enemy. They gave ground slowly, contesting every foot. The Byzantine cavalry attempted to sweep around the Muslim flanks. This is where Khalid's tactical brilliance first became evident. Rather than holding a static position, he kept his horsemen mobile, striking at the Byzantine cavalry and withdrawing before they could be pinned and destroyed. He could not stop the envelopment, but he slowed it, buying time for the center to maintain formation. The fighting intensified throughout the morning. The Byzantines rotated fresh troops into the line, a luxury the Muslims did not have. Every Muslim warrior was engaged. There was no reserve except men too wounded to fight effectively. Zayd ibn Haritha was struck multiple times. Spear thrusts penetrated his defenses. Sword cuts found gaps in his armor. Historical sources record that he continued fighting even as wounds accumulated. He held the white banner high, rallying men around him, until a Byzantine soldier delivered a fatal blow. Zayd fell. The banner dropped for a moment, and that moment could have meant disaster. A break in command during intense combat often leads to immediate rout. Men panic when they see their leader fall. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib seized the banner before it hit the ground. He was near the front, having fought alongside Zayd. The transition was seamless in execution, but traumatic in implication. The first commander was dead within hours of engagement commencing. Ja'far raised the banner and shouted for the men to hold. His voice carried authority. He had led Muslims through the migration to Abyssinia, had negotiated with kings, had fought in previous battles. The troops knew him and trusted him. Under Ja'far's command, the Muslim line reorganized. He could see what Zayd had seen. They could not win through conventional means. The Byzantine numbers were simply too great, but they could make the cost of victory devastating. They could fight with such ferocity that the Byzantines would hesitate to ever engage them again. Ja'far led a counterattack into the Byzantine center. It was tactically audacious and arguably reckless. He pushed forward with select fighters, trying to disrupt the Byzantine rhythm to create chaos in their superior formations. The move inflicted casualties. Muslim warriors broke through the first Byzantine rank, killing officers and disrupting unit cohesion. But the Byzantines had depth. Fresh units moved forward to seal the breach. Jafar found himself surrounded by enemy soldiers. The afternoon sun beat down on men who had been fighting for hours without respite. Exhaustion began to affect both sides, though the Byzantines could rotate troops while the Muslims could not. Bodies littered the battlefield. Blood turned the dust into mud in places. The Muslim flanks were being compressed. Khalid and Qutbah fought desperate holding actions, but the Byzantine cavalry advantage was telling. Slowly, inexorably, the Muslim formation was being encircled. Jafar recognized the danger. If the Byzantines completed the envelopment, the Muslims would be surrounded and annihilated. He needed to keep the Byzantine focus on the center to prevent them from committing fully to the flanking maneuver. He dismounted from his horse. This was a deliberate choice. In Arabian warfare, dismounting signaled absolute commitment. You would not retreat. You would fight until death or victory. There was no third option. Jafar cut his horse's legs to prevent anyone from retreating on it. Then he advanced into the Byzantine lines on foot, the white banner still in his hands, fighting with a fury that stunned even veteran Roman soldiers. The Byzantines pressed in on him from all sides. Swords and spears struck from every angle. Jafar held the banner with his right hand and fought with his left. When a sword severed his right arm, he transferred the banner to his left hand and continued fighting. Historical sources, particularly Ibn Ishaq and al-Walid, record what happened next with details that have become legendary. When his left arm was severed, Jafar held the banner between the stumps of his arms, pressing it against his chest. He continued to fight, kicking and headbutting Byzantine soldiers, refusing to let the banner fall. A Byzantine soldier thrust a spear through his torso. Jafar ibn Abi Talib fell, the banner finally slipping from his grasp. Later examination of his body would reveal 90 wounds, all from the front, not one from the back. He had not retreated a single step. Abdullah ibn Rawaha grabbed the banner, the third commander in succession. 2 had fallen. The day was not yet over. The battle raged on. Abdullah ibn Rawaha held the white banner and surveyed a battlefield that had become a slaughterhouse. 2 commanders lay dead. The Muslim formation had contracted into a defensive cluster, surrounded on 3 sides by Byzantine forces that continued to press inward. Escape routes were narrowing. The afternoon was advancing, and exhaustion was eroding the Muslim capacity to resist. Abdullah was a poet, a man who had spent much of his life crafting words, not just wielding weapons. But he was also a veteran of Badr, Uhud, and the campaigns that followed. He understood what this moment required. Not eloquence, but action. He rallied the surviving fighters around him. The Muslims had sustained heavy casualties, though exact numbers are disputed in historical sources. What is clear is that their combat effectiveness was degraded. Men fought with wounds that would have sent others fleeing. Thirst, exhaustion, and blood loss were taking their toll. Abdullah faced a tactical situation that offered no good options. The Byzantines had numeric superiority and were systematically compressing the Muslim position. Their cavalry had nearly completed the encirclement. Fresh Byzantine units continued to enter the battle, while every Muslim fighter had been engaged for hours. Yet Abdullah knew that retreat at this moment meant annihilation. The Byzantines would pursue a broken force across open ground and massacre them to the last man. The only option was to maintain formation and continue inflicting casualties at a rate that might give the Byzantines pause. He ordered a fighting withdrawal toward higher ground, a rocky outcrop that would provide some defensive advantage. This maneuver required discipline that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Men had to disengage from close combat, pull back in formation while under pressure, and re-establish defensive positions on new terrain. The Muslims executed the movement, but at terrible cost. Byzantine cavalry harassed the withdrawal, cutting down stragglers. Archers found targets among men whose shields had been shattered or lost. The distance to the rocky ground was perhaps 200 paces, but those paces cost dozens of lives. Abdullah positioned the survivors in a tighter defensive formation among the rocks. The terrain nullified some of the Byzantine cavalry advantage. Horsemen could not easily maneuver among the boulders and uneven ground. The Muslims could make the Byzantines pay for every foot of advance. Historical sources indicate Abdullah experienced a moment of doubt. He had spent the previous night composing poetry about his desire for martyrdom, about the worthlessness of life compared to the reward of dying in battle. But when the reality confronted him, when he saw the mass of Byzantine soldiers preparing another assault, human instinct warred with conviction. The sources, particularly al-Walid, record that Abdullah hesitated briefly before advancing. He recited verses to himself, reminding himself of what he had written about courage and faith. Then he moved forward to meet the Byzantine assault. He fought with the white banner in one hand and his sword in the other. Byzantine soldiers recognized the banner as the symbol of Muslim command. Capturing or destroying it would break Muslim morale. They concentrated their attacks on Abdullah. He killed several Byzantine soldiers in close combat. The sources mention his skill, despite being primarily known as a poet, rather than a professional warrior. He held his ground among the rocks, using the terrain to offset the Byzantine numbers. A Byzantine spear thrust caught him in the side. Abdullah staggered, but remained standing. He struck down the spearman and continued fighting. More wounds accumulated. A sword cut opened his shoulder. Another blade found his leg. Abdullah ibn Rawaha fell among the rocks, the third commander to die that day. The white banner dropped to the blood-soaked ground. The Muslim army faced its most critical moment. 3 commanders killed in succession. No designated leader remaining. The formation compressed into a shrinking defensive position with Byzantines attacking from multiple directions. Casualties mounting. No hope of reinforcement. This was the point where armies disintegrate. A soldier named Thabit ibn Arqam grabbed the banner. He was not a commander. He had no authority beyond his own initiative. But he understood that the banner could not remain on the ground. He held it high and called for someone to take command. The surviving Muslim fighters looked to their most experienced remaining warrior, Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid had been fighting on the right wing throughout the day. He had seen all 3 commanders fall. He had kept his cavalry functional despite overwhelming Byzantine pressure. He had preserved a degree of tactical cohesion when everything else was collapsing. When Thabit called for a commander, voices rose supporting Khalid. He was not in the chain of succession the Prophet had established. Zayd, Jafar, and Abdullah had been specifically named. Khalid, taking command, represented the army selecting its own leader in the field, a deviation from orders. But the alternative was annihilation. Khalid understood this. He rode to the center and took the white banner from Thabit. The transition happened quickly, without formal ceremony. There was no time for debate or protocol. Khalid's first assessment was brutal. The Muslims could not win this battle. The casualties were too severe, the Byzantine advantage too great. Continuing to fight in place meant complete destruction within hours. Retreat across open ground meant the same outcome, just more drawn out. He needed a tactical solution that did not exist in conventional military doctrine. He needed to disengage a surrounded force from an enemy that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude, preserve enough combat power to prevent pursuit, and execute a withdrawal that would allow survivors to reach friendly territory. The late afternoon sun was beginning its descent. Darkness would come in a few hours. That gave Khalid a resource: time. If he could maintain the defensive position until nightfall, he could attempt a maneuver that might save the army. He ordered the Muslims to hold their position among the rocks. No more attempts to attack or maneuver. Pure defense. Make the Byzantines pay for every approach. Use the terrain. Conserve strength where possible. The Byzantines launched another assault. They advanced in waves, using their numeric superiority to overwhelm defensive positions. Muslim warriors fought with desperation born of knowing this might be their last stand. Swords shattered from overuse. Spears broke. Men fought with daggers and rocks when other weapons failed. Khalid moved constantly along the defensive perimeter, reinforcing weak points, directing counterattacks against Byzantine penetrations, maintaining cohesion through force of will and tactical competence. Historical sources record that he broke 9 swords during the battle. 9 blades shattered in his hand from the intensity of combat. The sun touched the horizon. Twilight descended on a battlefield littered with dead and dying. The Byzantines pulled back to regroup. They had suffered far heavier casualties than anticipated. These Muslim warriors fought with a ferocity that shocked veteran Roman soldiers. Every advance cost lives. The Byzantine commanders assessed their situation. They had the Muslims surrounded and outnumbered. Victory was certain if they maintained pressure. But night combat was chaotic and dangerous. Better to wait for dawn and finish the destruction in daylight. That calculation gave Khalid the opening he needed. As darkness fell completely, he began implementing a plan that would become a masterpiece of military deception. Night covered the battlefield like a shroud. The Byzantines established a perimeter around the Muslim position, confident that dawn would bring the final destruction of the surrounded force. Campfires dotted the plain in a vast semicircle, a visual representation of overwhelming numeric superiority. Byzantine sentries watched the rocky outcrop where the Muslims had made their stand, ensuring no escape attempt would go unnoticed. Inside the Muslim defensive position, Khalid ibn al-Walid gathered the surviving commanders and fighters for a council of war. The situation was desperate, but not yet hopeless. He had a plan, but it required precision, discipline, and the kind of tactical deception that would only work once. Khalid's analysis was methodical. The Byzantines expected the Muslims to either surrender at dawn or fight to annihilation. They did not expect a competent withdrawal, because such a maneuver seemed impossible given the circumstances. That expectation was an exploitable weakness. He explained his strategy to the assembled fighters. During the night, they would reorganize the army's structure completely. Units would rotate positions. The vanguard would become the rear guard. The flanks would swap positions. Fresh fighters, those least wounded, would move to the front ranks. The purpose was psychological warfare. When dawn broke and the Byzantines observed the Muslim formation, they would see different faces in different positions. They would see fighters who appeared fresh rather than exhausted. The Byzantines would interpret this as evidence that reinforcements had arrived during the night. Khalid ordered additional measures to reinforce the deception. Small groups of cavalry would ride out beyond the Muslim position in the darkness, making wide circuits that would kick up dust and create noise suggesting the arrival of additional forces. Men would beat on shields and call out as if greeting incoming units. The movements began immediately. Khalid personally supervised the reorganization, ensuring every fighter understood their new position. The wounded who could still function were placed in the interior of the formation where they would not be immediately visible. The least damaged fighters moved to the perimeter. Cavalry units rode out into the night on their deception missions. They circled the Muslim position at distances calculated to be visible to Byzantine sentries, but far enough to appear as separate units approaching the battlefield. They created dust clouds by dragging branches behind their horses. They shouted greetings in Arabic that would carry to Byzantine ears. The Byzantines observed this activity with growing concern. Their scouts reported movement around the Muslim position. Dust clouds suggested multiple groups approaching. Voices carried across the night air, though the words were unintelligible to Greek and Ghassanid listeners. Byzantine commanders faced a tactical dilemma. If Muslim reinforcements had arrived in significant numbers, the situation changed dramatically. The Byzantines still held numeric advantage, but a refreshed Muslim force with additional troops would exact a far higher cost than the exhausted remnant they had been fighting. Intelligence estimates varied wildly. Some scouts reported seeing what appeared to be thousands of additional troops. Others were more conservative. The darkness made accurate assessment impossible. Byzantine commanders erred on the side of caution. Dawn broke on the second day of battle. The Byzantines deployed their forces for what they anticipated would be the final assault. As the light improved, they observed the Muslim formation and saw exactly what Khalid intended them to see. Reorganized ranks with different fighters in different positions, men who appeared less worn than the previous day's combatants, and a formation that suggested increased strength rather than a defeated remnant. The Byzantines hesitated. If the Muslims had been reinforced, launching an immediate assault might prove costly. Better to probe the defenses, assess the actual situation, and then commit to a decisive attack. Byzantine skirmishers advanced to test the Muslim lines. Khalid had positioned his strongest remaining fighters at the front specifically for this moment. They met the Byzantine probe with fierce resistance, fighting with an intensity that suggested fresh troops rather than exhausted survivors. The Byzantine skirmishers fell back and reported to their commanders. The Muslims were fighting as if reinforced. The formation was reorganized. The defensive positions were stronger than the previous evening. This is where Khalid's understanding of Byzantine military doctrine became crucial. The Roman military tradition emphasized avoiding unnecessary casualties. Byzantine generals were trained to achieve objectives with minimal losses to their own forces. An enemy that appeared strengthened and willing to inflict heavy casualties was an enemy that required careful handling. The Byzantine command made a decision that would define the battle's outcome. Rather than launch a potentially costly assault against what might be a reinforced enemy, they would maintain the siege and wait for the Muslims to exhaust their supplies. Thirst and hunger would do what frontal assault might achieve at too high a price. Khalid recognized the Byzantine hesitation immediately. This was his opportunity. The Byzantines were off balance, uncertain, operating on incomplete information. He needed to exploit that uncertainty before they regained confidence. He organized the Muslim formation for a fighting withdrawal. This is among the most difficult military maneuvers to execute. An army must disengage from contact with the enemy, maintain formation while moving, defend against pursuit, and avoid disintegration into rout. Doing this while outnumbered requires extraordinary discipline. Khalid designated rear guard units to hold positions while the main body began moving. He selected the most reliable fighters for these positions, men who would not break under pressure. The rear guard would maintain contact with the Byzantines, giving the appearance of continued battle while the bulk of the force withdrew. The movement began slowly. Units disengaged from their positions in sequence, pulling back while maintaining formation. The rear guard held firm, absorbing Byzantine probing attacks and giving the impression of static defense rather than withdrawal. The Byzantines initially did not recognize what was happening. The Muslim positions appeared to be holding. Fighters were visible in the defensive perimeter. Combat continued at points of contact. Only gradually did Byzantine observers realize the Muslim main body was thinning. By the time Byzantine commanders understood a withdrawal was underway, Khalid had created sufficient distance to make immediate pursuit difficult. The rear guard maintained cohesion, presenting a defensive front that would make any Byzantine cavalry charge costly. Byzantine cavalry units moved to harass the withdrawal, but Khalid had anticipated this. He had positioned his own remaining cavalry to screen the retreat, engaging Byzantine horsemen and preventing them from reaching the withdrawing infantry. The cavalry actions were brief and violent, neither side seeking decisive engagement, the Muslims simply buying time and distance. The withdrawal continued throughout the morning. Khalid rotated units through the rear guard position, preventing exhaustion from degrading their combat effectiveness. Fresh fighters moved to the back, while tired units advanced into the relative safety of the formation's interior. The Byzantines pursued, but cautiously. Their scouts reported that the Muslim formation remained intact, that the rear guard fought with disciplined ferocity, and that cavalry screens prevented easy harassment of the main body. The fear of reinforcements still influenced Byzantine decision-making. Khalid directed the withdrawal toward terrain that favored defense. Narrow wadis, rocky ground, anything that would nullify Byzantine numeric advantage if they forced battle. He kept the army moving at a pace that balanced speed against formation integrity. Throughout the day, the Muslims maintained discipline despite exhaustion, wounds, thirst, and the psychological burden of continuous combat. Khalid moved constantly through the formation, encouraging, directing, repositioning units as needed. His presence held the army together when every natural instinct would have been to scatter and flee. By afternoon, the Muslim withdrawal had created significant distance from the initial battlefield. The Byzantines continued pursuit, but without commitment to decisive engagement. Their commanders remained uncertain about Muslim strength and intentions. As the second day's sun began setting, Khalid assessed that the immediate crisis had passed. The Byzantines were not going to risk a major engagement against an enemy that had demonstrated such tactical competence and fighting spirit. The withdrawal could continue with decreasing risk of catastrophic pursuit. The Muslim army marched through the night, putting more distance between themselves and the Byzantine forces. Men collapsed from exhaustion, but were helped to their feet by comrades. The wounded were carried. Not a single fighter was abandoned. By the third day, Byzantine pursuit had effectively ended. Their cavalry shadowed the Muslim withdrawal at a distance, but made no aggressive moves. The cost of the battle had been severe for both sides, but the Byzantines had learned a harsh lesson. Engaging these Muslim warriors came at a price far higher than their numbers suggested. Khalid continued the withdrawal for several more days, ensuring his force reached areas where Byzantine pursuit was no longer viable. Only when he was certain of safety did he allow the exhausted army to make proper camp and rest. The Muslim army's withdrawal from Mu'tah represents one of the most successful retrograde operations in military history. Khalid ibn al-Walid had extracted a force that was surrounded, outnumbered, and seemingly doomed, preserving the majority of his fighters and inflicting casualties that would resonate throughout the Byzantine Empire for years. The tactical deception Khalid employed during the night of the first day proved decisive. The reorganization of units, the movement of cavalry to simulate reinforcements, and the positioning of fresh fighters at visible points created an illusion that fundamentally altered Byzantine decision-making. Roman commanders, operating on incomplete intelligence and facing an enemy that refused to behave like a defeated force, chose caution over aggression. This choice had strategic implications far beyond the immediate battlefield. The Byzantine Empire had mobilized 200,000 soldiers to crush 3,000 Muslim fighters. They had achieved tactical success by any conventional measure. They held the field, they had killed 3 Muslim commanders, and they had inflicted significant casualties. Yet they had failed to destroy the Muslim army. More critically, they had suffered losses that shocked their leadership. Historical sources vary on casualty figures, as is common for battles from this period. Muslim sources, including al-Walid and Ibn Ishaq, suggest Byzantine and Ghassanid casualties numbered in the thousands, possibly exceeding 10,000 dead. Byzantine sources are largely silent on specific numbers, which itself suggests the losses were substantial enough to be embarrassing. What is documented across multiple sources is the ferocity of the Muslim resistance. Byzantine soldiers who survived the battle reported fighting men who seemed indifferent to death, who charged into overwhelming odds without hesitation, who fought on despite wounds that would incapacitate normal troops. This psychological impact proved as significant as the physical casualties. Khalid's withdrawal strategy exploited Byzantine military doctrine in ways that demonstrated his profound understanding of Roman tactical thinking. Byzantine generals were trained to achieve objectives with minimal losses. The empire's military system relied on professional soldiers who were expensive to recruit, train, and maintain. Casualties affected not just immediate combat power, but long-term military capacity. When faced with an enemy that appeared willing and able to inflict heavy losses, Byzantine commanders defaulted to caution. They would besiege, they would maneuver, they would wait for favorable conditions rather than accept preventable casualties. Khalid recognized this tendency and manipulated it brilliantly. The cavalry screens he employed during the withdrawal were textbook examples of economy of force. Small units of horsemen engaged Byzantine cavalry in brief, violent clashes that prevented the larger Byzantine mounted forces from reaching the withdrawing Muslim infantry. These actions were not intended to defeat the Byzantine cavalry, but simply to delay and disrupt them. Each cavalry clash bought time measured in minutes, but those minutes accumulated into hours of unmolested withdrawal. Khalid rotated his cavalry units to prevent exhaustion, ensuring he always had fresh riders available to contest Byzantine pursuit. The Byzantine cavalry, despite massive numeric superiority, could not exploit their advantage because they could not achieve clean contact with the Muslim main body. The terrain selection during the withdrawal showed Khalid's tactical acumen. He directed the retreat through wadis and rocky ground whenever possible, areas where Byzantine heavy cavalry and massed infantry could not deploy effectively. When forced to cross open ground, he did so quickly, and with cavalry screens active, minimizing exposure to Byzantine strength. The discipline maintained by the Muslim fighters during this withdrawal was extraordinary. These were men who had fought for hours against overwhelming odds, who had watched 3 commanders die, who were exhausted, wounded, and thirsty. Natural instinct would dictate panic and rout. Instead, they maintained formation, followed orders, and fought when necessary. This discipline reflected both the quality of the fighters and the effectiveness of Khalid's leadership. He had assumed command of an army in crisis, without formal authority, and imposed order through competence and force of personality. The fighters trusted him because he demonstrated immediate mastery of an impossible situation. By the 4th day of withdrawal, the Muslim army had created sufficient distance that Byzantine pursuit became logistically impractical. The Byzantines would have had to extend their supply lines deep into territory where their control was contested, chasing an enemy that had proven capable of inflicting severe casualties even when defeated. Byzantine commanders made the rational decision to terminate pursuit. They had achieved their stated objective of repelling the Muslim incursion. Continuing the chase risked further losses for diminishing returns. The Muslim force was retreating southward, away from Byzantine territories. Let them go. This Byzantine decision validated Khalid's entire strategy. He had transformed a tactical defeat into a strategic stalemate by making continued engagement appear more costly than the benefits it would yield. The Byzantines held the field at Mu'tah, but they had failed to destroy the Muslim military capacity. Khalid continued the withdrawal at a measured pace, ensuring his men had opportunities to rest, treat wounds, and recover from exhaustion. He organized foraging parties to find water and food. He maintained security protocols to guard against ambush or surprise attack. The withdrawal was methodical and professional. As the Muslim army approached the areas where tribal loyalties shifted toward the Islamic State, the risk of Byzantine pursuit diminished further. Khalid could finally assess the full extent of his losses and the condition of his force. The casualties were severe. Estimates vary, but credible sources suggest the Muslims lost between 700 and 1,000 fighters killed, with many more wounded. From a force of 3,000, this represented losses approaching 1/3. 3 commanders were dead, including men of significant political and military importance. Yet 2/3 of the army survived. In a battle where annihilation was the expected outcome, where conventional military analysis predicted complete destruction, Khalid had preserved a functional fighting force. The survivors were veterans who had faced the full might of the Byzantine Empire and lived. Their experience and the psychological impact of survival would prove invaluable in future campaigns. The weapons Khalid had broken during the battle became legendary. 9 swords shattered in his hand from the intensity of combat. This detail, recorded in multiple early sources, illustrates not just the ferocity of the fighting, but also Khalid's personal role in combat. He led from the front, exposing himself to the same dangers as the lowest-ranked fighter. This leadership style, dangerous as it was, earned him absolute loyalty from the troops. They had seen him fight alongside them, had watched him risk death repeatedly, had witnessed his tactical brilliance under extreme pressure. When he gave orders during the withdrawal, men obeyed without question because they trusted his judgment absolutely. As the Muslim army drew closer to Medina, Khalid faced a different kind of challenge. He had deviated from the command structure the Prophet Muhammad had established. He had assumed leadership without explicit authorization, after the 3 designated commanders had fallen. Some might view this as usurpation of authority, rather than battlefield necessity. The returning fighters worried about their reception. They had not achieved victory. 3 beloved commanders were dead. The mission to punish those responsible for killing the Muslim emissary remained incomplete. Would they be viewed as failures who had fled the battlefield? These concerns intensified as the army approached Medina. Khalid understood the political dimensions of military outcomes. A tactical defeat, no matter how well executed the withdrawal, could still be portrayed as failure. He needed to frame the battle's results in terms that emphasized the extraordinary achievement of survival and the casualties inflicted on the Byzantines. The army entered Medina to a complex reception. Some residents, seeing the reduced numbers and missing commanders, began criticizing the survivors. Accusations of cowardice and flight circulated. Children threw dust at returning fighters, echoing their parents' disappointment. This initial reaction threatened to turn a strategic success into a political disaster. The fighters had endured hell at Mu'tah, had fought with courage against impossible odds, and were now being condemned for surviving. Morale plummeted. The psychological wounds of this reception cut deeper than the physical injuries sustained in battle. Khalid and the other surviving commanders sought an audience with the Prophet Muhammad. They needed authoritative validation of their decisions and actions. Without it, the entire expedition risked being remembered as shameful failure, rather than extraordinary military achievement. The Prophet's response would determine not just how Mu'tah was remembered, but also the future viability of Muslim military operations against major powers like Byzantium. The Prophet Muhammad's response to the returning army from Mu'tah became a defining moment in early Islamic military history. When Khalid and the surviving commanders presented themselves, expecting possible censure for the casualties and incomplete mission, the Prophet instead praised their actions. Muhammad specifically addressed the accusations of cowardice being leveled at the survivors. He declared that they had not fled but had executed a strategic withdrawal. He stated that they were not deserters, but rather a force that would return to fight another day. Most significantly, he gave Khalid ibn al-Walid a title that would become legendary, Saifullah, the Sword of Allah. This endorsement transformed the narrative around Mu'tah. What had initially appeared as a defeat was reframed as a demonstration of tactical brilliance and extraordinary courage. The Prophet's interpretation carried absolute authority within the Muslim community. Criticism of the survivors ceased. The dust-throwing stopped. Instead, the fighters were honored for having faced overwhelming odds and survived through skill and determination. The strategic implications of this reframing were profound. The Muslim community learned that victory was not always measured by holding territory or destroying the enemy. Sometimes survival against impossible odds constituted success. Sometimes inflicting heavy casualties on a superior force achieved strategic objectives, even without tactical victory. The Battle of Mu'tah had immediate effects on the regional balance of power. The Byzantine Empire had mobilized a massive force to crush what they viewed as a minor threat from the Arabian Peninsula. They had failed to achieve decisive results. The Muslims had withdrawn, but they had done so in good order, inflicting casualties that shocked Roman military leadership. Byzantine intelligence reports from the aftermath of Mu'tah indicate significant concern about Muslim military capabilities. The ferocity of the fighting, the discipline under extreme pressure, and the tactical competence displayed by Khalid's withdrawal contradicted Byzantine assumptions about Arabian tribal warriors. These were not undisciplined raiders, but organized soldiers capable of sophisticated military operations. The casualty figures, while disputed in exact numbers, were undeniably heavy on both sides. Muslim losses of approximately 700 to 1,000 dead from 3,000 represented severe attrition, but Byzantine losses, estimated in various sources as ranging from 3,000 to 12,000 dead, represented a shocking result for an army that outnumbered its opponent by such a massive margin. The ratio of casualties inflicted versus casualties received became a critical metric. The Muslims had been outnumbered approximately 67 to 1, yet the casualty ratio was far more balanced, possibly as favorable as 3 to 1 in favor of the Byzantines rather than the 67 to 1 that numeric superiority should have produced. This mathematical reality had strategic consequences. If engaging 3,000 Muslims cost the Byzantine Empire several thousand casualties, what would be the cost of fighting 30,000 or 300,000? The empire's military planners had to reassess their assumptions about the cost of confronting the expanding Islamic State. The Ghassanid Arab tribes that had fought alongside the Byzantines at Mu'tah were particularly affected. They had witnessed their co-religionists and fellow Arabs fighting with a conviction and ferocity that raised uncomfortable questions. The Ghassanids had served Byzantine interests for over a century, but the rising Islamic State offered an alternative that was becoming increasingly attractive. Within months of Mu'tah, Byzantine intelligence reported increased defections among Arab tribal allies. Tribes that had previously been reliable clients began hedging their loyalties. Some sent emissaries to Medina to explore accommodation with the Muslims. The psychological impact of Mu'tah rippled through the tribal networks of the region. The Muslim community underwent its own transformation in response to Mu'tah. The battle demonstrated that the nascent Islamic State could project military power beyond the Arabian Peninsula and survive contact with major imperial forces. This revelation encouraged more aggressive strategic planning. Khalid ibn al-Walid emerged from Mu'tah with a reputation that would define the rest of his career. The title Sword of Allah was not merely honorific. It represented recognition of his tactical genius and his ability to achieve results in impossible circumstances. Military commanders throughout the Muslim territories studied his actions at Mu'tah, particularly the nighttime reorganization and the fighting withdrawal. The techniques Khalid employed became standard doctrine in Islamic military practice. The use of cavalry screens during withdrawal, the rotation of units to maintain combat effectiveness, the psychological warfare through deception, and the selection of defensive terrain all became teaching points for subsequent generations of Muslim commanders. The three fallen commanders became martyrs whose stories were told throughout the Muslim community. Zayd ibn Haritha, the freed slave who chose loyalty over freedom and died leading men in battle. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who fought until both arms were severed and his body bore 90 wounds, all from the front. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, the poet who conquered his own doubts to die holding the banner high. These narratives served multiple purposes. They provided exemplars of courage and sacrifice. They demonstrated that leadership in the Islamic State was based on merit and commitment rather than tribal lineage or wealth. They inspired subsequent fighters who would face their own impossible odds in future battles. The Byzantine Empire's strategic posture toward the Islamic State shifted after Mu'tah. Prior to the battle, Muslim expansion had been viewed as a manageable problem, a matter of frontier security that could be addressed through client tribes and limited military intervention. After Mu'tah, Byzantine strategic planning had to account for a capable military force led by tactically brilliant commanders. Emperor Heraclius, who had personally ordered the mobilization for Mu'tah, received reports that troubled him deeply. The Muslims had not been crushed. They had withdrawn in good order. They had inflicted casualties that were strategically significant, and they showed every indication of returning. The cost-benefit analysis of confronting Muslim expansion became more complex. The Byzantine Empire was still recovering from decades of devastating war with Persia. Imperial finances were strained. The military had sustained losses at Mu'tah that, while sustainable in absolute terms, represented a concerning trend if replicated in future engagements. Byzantine military planning shifted toward defensive strategies in the southern frontier regions. Rather than seeking decisive battle to crush Muslim forces, the emphasis moved to containment through fortifications, client tribes, and limited engagement. This strategic adjustment gave the Islamic State breathing room to consolidate its position in Arabia. Within 2 years of Mu'tah, the Muslims would launch the conquest of Mecca, bringing the entire Arabian Peninsula under Islamic control. The confidence to undertake this campaign derived partly from the lessons and reputation earned at Mu'tah. If Muslim forces could survive confrontation with the Byzantine Empire, they could certainly handle internal Arabian opponents. Khalid ibn al-Walid's role in future campaigns was assured. The Prophet Muhammad increasingly relied on him for military operations requiring tactical sophistication. Khalid would go on to lead campaigns against both the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire, never losing a battle in a career spanning over 100 engagements. The reputation forged at Mu'tah preceded him. Enemy commanders knew they faced the sword of Allah, a man who had extracted an army from certain annihilation and turned tactical defeat into strategic advantage. This psychological factor affected enemy morale and decision-making in subsequent battles. The Muslim military system evolved in response to Mu'tah's lessons. Training emphasized discipline under pressure. Command structures incorporated flexibility to allow field promotion when circumstances required. Tactical doctrine stressed mobility, aggressive action even when outnumbered, and the importance of inflicting maximum casualties on superior enemies. These institutional changes transformed the Muslim military from a tribal militia into a professional fighting force capable of confronting empires. The transition was not complete at Mu'tah, but the battle accelerated developments that would culminate in the rapid conquests of subsequent decades. The Battle of Mu'tah in 629 stands as a watershed moment in military history, not for what was won in traditional terms, but for what it revealed about leadership, tactical innovation, and the strategic value of survival against impossible odds. The immediate legacy of Mu'tah manifested in the campaigns that followed. Within 8 years of the battle, Muslim armies under Khalid ibn al-Walid's command would return to the very regions where they had fought the Byzantines. But this time, they came not as a small expeditionary force, but as a conquering army that would permanently alter the map of the Middle East. The conquest of Syria began in 634, just 5 years after Mu'tah. Khalid commanded Muslim forces that defeated multiple Byzantine armies, including at the decisive Battle of Yarmouk in 636. At Yarmouk, the tactical principles he had demonstrated at Mu'tah were applied on a larger scale: mobility, aggressive action despite numeric disadvantage, and the use of terrain to offset enemy superiority. The Byzantine soldiers who faced Khalid at Yarmouk included veterans of Mu'tah. They knew his reputation. They had seen what his 3,000 had done to a force of 200,000. That psychological burden affected Byzantine morale before the first sword was drawn. Fear is a weapon, and Khalid wielded it as effectively as he wielded steel. The conquest of Iraq followed a similar pattern. Khalid led Muslim forces against the Sassanid Persian Empire, winning a series of battles that culminated in the collapse of Persian resistance in Mesopotamia. The Persians, like the Byzantines, discovered that numeric superiority meant less against an enemy willing to accept casualties while inflicting devastating losses in return. These conquests were not inevitable. They required tactical brilliance, strategic vision, and extraordinary military skill. The commanders who led them had been forged in battles like Mu'tah, where survival itself was an achievement, and where every tactical decision carried existential consequences. The 3 commanders who died at Mu'tah became permanent fixtures in Islamic historical memory. Zayd ibn Haritha, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha were commemorated in literature, poetry, and oral tradition. Their deaths were not portrayed as failures, but as martyrdom in the highest cause, examples of leadership that demanded personal sacrifice. Ja'far's story particularly resonated. The image of a warrior holding a banner with the stumps of his severed arms, refusing to retreat, became a symbol of absolute commitment. Whether every detail of the account is historically precise matters less than its function as an inspirational narrative that shaped subsequent generations of Muslim fighters. The location of Mu'tah itself became a site of historical significance. The village in modern Jordan where the battle occurred was commemorated with monuments and remembrances. Pilgrims visited the area to honor the martyrs. The physical landscape became intertwined with the sacred narrative of early Islamic military triumph over adversity. The military lessons of Mu'tah extended beyond the Islamic world. The fighting withdrawal Khalid executed became a case study in military academies of how to extract a surrounded force from superior enemies. The use of nighttime reorganization to create the illusion of reinforcements demonstrated the value of psychological warfare in pre-modern combat. The principle that strategic victory can emerge from tactical defeat influenced military thinking across cultures. Generals studying Mu'tah recognized that holding the battlefield mattered less than preserving combat power and achieving strategic objectives. The Byzantines held the field at Mu'tah, but they failed to destroy the Muslim military capacity, and that failure had consequences that echoed for centuries. Khalid ibn al-Walid's reputation as one of history's great military commanders rests substantially on his performance at Mu'tah. Taking command of a defeated surrounded army and extracting it while inflicting heavy casualties on a vastly superior force requires a combination of tactical brilliance, coolness under pressure, and innovative thinking that few commanders in history have demonstrated. His subsequent career validated the reputation earned at Mu'tah. He never lost a battle in over 100 engagements against the 2 greatest military powers of his era. This record is virtually unmatched in military history. Napoleon lost battles. Hannibal lost battles. Alexander faced close calls. Khalid did not lose. The question of what makes great leadership finds partial answer in Mu'tah. Khalid demonstrated that great commanders adapt to circumstances rather than adhering rigidly to doctrine. He understood when conventional tactics were suicide and when unconventional approaches offered the only path to survival. He read his enemy's psychology and exploited their assumptions. The courage demonstrated by the Muslim fighters at Mu'tah raises questions about motivation in combat. What makes men stand against odds of 67 to 1? Religious conviction played a role, certainly, but so did trust in leadership, unit cohesion, and the warrior culture that early Islam cultivated. These factors combined to produce soldiers who fought with effectiveness far beyond what their numbers suggested. The Byzantine failure to destroy the Muslim force at Mu'tah illustrates the limits of numeric superiority. 200,000 soldiers could not crush 3,000 because the 3,000 refused to behave like a defeated force. They fought with such ferocity that the Byzantines became cautious. That caution created the opening Khalid needed for his withdrawal. This dynamic appears repeatedly in military history. Superior numbers guarantee nothing if the inferior force fights with determination and tactical skill. The Spartans at Thermopylae, the Texans at the Alamo, the British at Rorke's Drift all demonstrated that small forces can achieve strategic effects beyond their size through courage and tactical competence. Mu'tah belongs in this category of battles, where the defeated force achieved more through their resistance than the victorious force achieved through their conquest. The Byzantines won the field, but lost the strategic initiative. The Muslims lost the field but gained prestige, experience, and the psychological advantage that comes from having faced the worst and survived. The legacy of Mu'tah extends into contemporary military doctrine. Modern armies study retrograde operations, and Khalid's withdrawal provides a historical example of best practices. The use of deception, the maintenance of unit cohesion under pressure, the employment of economy of force principles, and the exploitation of enemy psychology remain relevant regardless of technological changes. The human element of Mu'tah resonates across centuries. The fear that Abdullah ibn Rawaha felt before advancing to his death was real. The exhaustion of men who fought for hours against overwhelming odds was real. The grief of communities who lost fathers, sons, and brothers was real. War's costs are always measured in human suffering, and Mu'tah extracted a heavy price. Yet the story endures because it demonstrates that ordinary humans can achieve extraordinary things when led effectively, and when fighting for causes they believe transcend individual survival. The 3,000 at Mu'tah were not superhuman. They were men who chose to stand when retreat was rational, who fought when surrender was easier, and who trusted their leaders even unto death. The Battle of Mu'tah teaches that victory and defeat are not always clear categories. The Muslims did not win in conventional terms, but they achieved strategic objectives. The Byzantines did not lose in conventional terms, but they failed to prevent the Muslim threat they had mobilized to crush. History remembers Mu'tah as a Muslim triumph, precisely because it should have been an annihilation. 3,000 men faced 200,000 and survived through tactical brilliance, extraordinary courage, and leadership that turned disaster into legend. That is the legacy that echoes through 14 centuries to the present day. If you found this story compelling, explore more about Khalid ibn al-Walid's campaigns in Syria and Iraq, where the lessons of Mu'tah were applied on an even larger scale. Subscribe for more deep dives into the battles and leaders that shaped world history. Leave a comment with your thoughts on leadership under impossible pressure. What would you have done in Khalid's position at Mu'tah?